Perfect. Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul, and consultant here in Montana. We've got about 4 feet. Well, we've got like 5 inches of snow just in the last little bit. It's probably a little bit colder than where you guys are at. Antonio, where are you at?
I'm in Guatemala City.
Oh, that's so pretty. Yeah, it's nice. The weather is always right. It's always exactly perfect, right? 70 degrees or something.
It's a little warm in the afternoon, but it's only a few hours, and I would say that though. Yeah, perfect weather for sure.
I remember sitting there, it was like, yeah, wherever I went, it seemed like the right temperature. The buildings are just kind of open. Nice. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming. Hey, group, we're going to just wait a second to kind of get started, and then we're going to dig into engineering. Big thanks for coming. I know you guys are really busy having days and then coming after school and all of that, so I super appreciate it. It'd be great if you could start to utilize the chat. And if you got questions or anything kind of along the way, my wife Laura is going to be here, and she'll kind of monitor that and make sure that everything kind of gets hit along the way. We're also going to have a chunk of time at the end for some reflections and also some questions. So I would encourage you, as we go through this session, just have something you can jot some ideas down. So if you get a reflection or a question jumps to mind of like either like we found this works or how do you do this? I've worked with dozens of schools, and so I'd love to, at the end, as we get there, like be able to help out, at least give you advice on other things that I've seen. So hopefully that can help you. And so I'm going to get started here. Without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll just kind of get rolling. So let me do that. Perfect. Nice. Antonio, can you see that? Engineering a Better Future, does that show up for you okay? Thank you so much. Alrighty, so I'm going to go through and share some thoughts that I have around engineering kind of and the importance of engineering as we start to launch this. Another thing in my own learning around NGSS for the last 8 years is I really had to teach myself what engineering is. And how is engineering different than science? And more importantly, how is engineering different than inventing? I hope that's a takeaway that you come from this afternoon. Engineering is really application of science to solve problems. And so I'm going to kind of share some of those with you. I've also got some mini lessons that we're going to do and kind of take you through that and show you how you could teach some of your kids some of the things that we're talking about here. I wanted to start by sharing a website that I make called The Wonder of Science with my wife, Laura, and it's based on all the work that we do everywhere. And we put together a page for just this workshop and all the other Tri-Association workshops that we've been to. Laura, if you don't mind throwing that in the chat, it would be great. So it's thewonderofscience.com/try. And I'm going to show you some new resources that I've developed around engineering and some cards and ways that you can make this kind of explicit in getting kids to understand what engineering is and teachers to understand what engineering is. And so everything will be linked up there. I'm also going to show you some slides, and I'll put my slideshow there as a PDF. So if you see a graphic or something that you want to use later, you should be able to come here and then find it. To start, I travel quite a bit, and this is where I run into engineering. I don't know if anybody's run into a bath like this. Claire, I saw you smile. So like for me, I remember spending like 5 minutes trying to figure out how to turn the bath into a shower. If you've ever seen one of these before. So it took me a while to figure out that you have to pull on the spout ring underneath, and that's connected to the shower, and so the water starts to go up. What I like about design and about engineering is I love seeing good design and bad design. I love to see it in the world around me, and I work so hard to make really, really good design. I think one thing that we should get out of the way right away is that there is no science of teaching. Teaching is engineering. There's no one right way to teach. We're all engineers just doing the best we can in the circumstances that we have. And so making a lesson on 4 hours of sleep, given this much time to teach these many kids in this bit of time is all about criteria and constraints. And so as I travel, I see lots of different types of showers. And I always am interested in like how they were designed and what kind of constraints did they use to make this. This is one here in Montana, which I'm still not sure exactly how it works. This is one, I don't know if anybody's seen one of these. This is in Ecuador, or a shower like this before. Felipe, like this terrified me the first time I took a shower in something like this. I thought I was going to die. Costa Rica, it sounds like we have showers there that are similar to this. The shower was quite short and they couldn't take a shower. That's funny in the chat. One time I was in a shower and it was connected to the electric leads in the house. And so you got shocked every time you were in the shower as well. So we had to take showers with shoes on. This is one I took, I think, outside of Chicago. And this one makes no sense when you look at it. Like, why did they design to put that there? And I think a lot of it, anybody know why they put this here? Any thoughts? Oh, this is handicapped accessible. So like the constraints now are, if I pull up to it, I want to be able to adjust it when I'm in the wheelchair and then kind of move into the bath. So like, as we look at designs, it's really important to think about like what forced those designs and where those designs come from. I think something we heard from the engineer Vianney earlier, and I think we'll hear over and over and over again if you haven't heard it before, is that women are underrepresented in a lot of fields of engineering. So let's just look at the numbers for a sec. So if we look in the US, this is a census from 2010 to 2019. If you look at women or people who identify as female, they represent about 50% of the workforce, which makes sense. If we then look at in the STEM fields, that number is going to be way, way less. And if I bust that apart, the STEM data, then it becomes kind of really interesting. So if you look at the data, if we look at women who are going on to be mathematicians or scientists, they're really close to 50%, if not beyond 50%. So this is not a problem of all of STEM. This is a problem specifically of computer science and engineering. And not specifically of engineering, but certain types of mechanical industrial engineering. So like, I'm going to make a bold claim. And my bold claim is that girls are not hearing that they could be engineers from people like us enough. That they should be doing engineering from kindergarten through grade 12. And if they did, they would start to realize I could be good at this and I might choose that as a field. Like, more girls have to hear, you could be a really good designer, you could be a really good engineer, you could be a computer scientist, you can do whatever you want. I think we heard that as evidence today from the NASA engineer. Like, it was a 6th grade teacher who told her she could do this. That's the only reason that she did it. And so I think our role is to not only explicitly tell kids that, but literally teach engineering in our science classes. They're a part of our standards. And I think we've done a really good job of telling girls they could be good mathematicians and scientists. It's in the evidence. We just don't see it in some of these other fields. And I think it's because we're not teaching it every year, all the way through. Like, what do we do in schools a lot of the time? We make a little makerspace or a place where kids can self-select to go there, but that's not all the kids. And so I think that's kind of important. First thing that I had to do when I kind of dug into the NGSS was to really wrap my head around the difference between science and engineering. This is maybe the most famous scientist on our planet right now who's currently doing work, Jennifer Doudna. Jennifer Doudna is famous. She just got the Nobel Prize for CRISPR, coming up with a way that we could start to modify DNA and our genes. When they interviewed Jennifer and asked her, why did you become a scientist? She said, I grew up on Hawaii and I fell in love with nature, and I was always out in nature. And that love of nature got me interested in science and understanding how the world works. I think origin stories are really, really important. This is one of the most famous engineers that we have on the planet right now. So Gwen Shotwell, she's the lead engineer at SpaceX. I'm sure you've heard of some of the work that they're doing as well. When they interviewed Gwen about why she became an engineer, she said, I went to a women's in engineering meeting when I was in high school. And there was an engineer there and she had the coolest clothes on, like really fancy clothes. And she says, I hate to admit it, but I saw that you could be an engineer and can have like really cool clothes. And I was like, I'm going to be an engineer. And so I think like that, it just shows you the importance of like all of these little workshops and things that we're doing, because you're kind of changing kids' lives. Also showing them a pathway forward, I think, is really, really important. I'm going to speak about my wife for a second. I know she's on here, but maybe not on video. But she was the academic advisor at MSU, or Montana State University, in mechanical engineering. And so she would work with kids as they came in as freshmen. And a lot of the time it was telling them, no, this is not really what an engineer does. This is what an engineer does. And I think you shouldn't find that out when you're in your freshman year of majoring in something. Like, this is what it is. So like, I think we can kind of do some of that in secondary school. The difference between the two is super important. For me, it was important for me to wrap my head around these two things, science and engineering. A lot of the work we've done in the partnership so far has been in the orange here. It's about science and how do we understand about the world through a process of inquiry where we ask questions and construct explanations. And so here's my quick definition for what scientists do. They explain the natural world. They explain how it works. That's what scientists do. What engineers do, they don't do that. They define human problems and then they come up with solutions to the problems. And those are totally different processes. In fact, the way it actually plays out in your brain is different. If you are a scientist, you're gathering all this evidence and you're paring it down to the one or two testable explanations for this phenomena. So it's a real convergent thought process. Like, what do you have to do as a teacher? You have to find a really cool phenomena that kids should access and actually come to an explanation of what's going on. Engineering is the different. Engineering, you come up with a problem, and then there's an infinite number of solutions to that problem. And who comes up with those? The kids come up with those. And so the processes are different in the way that we do it and also where we start. For you as a teacher, the hardest part about teaching science through inquiry is finding a phenomena that you can use to teach the science and the kids will find interesting. What will be the hardest thing in teaching engineering? Finding an authentic problem that the kids are going to solve. Which sequence do we do this in? I would always argue, start with the science. Learn the science first, and then once we've learned the science, then apply it in the engineering that we're actually going to do. And so thinking about engineering as more of an application of science. This is my friend. Glenn Bradbury, teaches a class and taught one here at our high school in Bozeman, Montana. And he taught this class really successfully for years. It was a computer-aided design where the kids would design material. He then got funding, so Project Lead the Way funding. And so he had to change the name of the course from computer-aided design to elements of engineering. And you can see the gender difference in the sign up for those two classes. Simply by changing the name of the course from design to engineering, all of a sudden you had no females signing up for the class. So engineering kind of has a bad rap. It's got a bad name. And so like ways that we can change that are to explicitly add it at all grade levels. So kids keep hearing that over and over again. And also I think another thing is just using that word design. Like we're all designers and we all can come up with solutions to problems is another way to start thinking about that. For me, this is the last time I was in a class. I was teaching a class of physical science and I had 50% girls and 50% boys. So I had two big classes of this. And I decided to teach my whole physical science. So this is a ninth grade class. The whole physical science was using engineering. We did robotics, we did electronics, we did all kinds of engineering. I'd never really done it before in a class. And what I found in that class is at the beginning, it was a struggle for some of the girls who were in the class. They just hadn't done engineering. They hadn't done a lot of that. And so it took a while to get it going. But then by the end, they were far outperforming the boys in my class on every engineering test that we had. And the limit ended up being the boys had a hard time communicating on complex solutions to problems. And so I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm saying, like, in my own experience as a teacher, you just got to start doing it. And girls have to see that they can be super successful in it, and then they'll do fine. But like, we have to open up those opportunities for them to do it. That's just in my own experience. And again, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a female, but I have seen this in a lot of the work that we've done. By the end, they made these little sumo wrestling robots that were just crazy awesome. It was fun to do too. So one thing to kind of, before we dig into specifics of engineering, I think it's important for us to know that, like, you should already be engineering. So if we look at the NGSS standards, which is what this whole partnership is about, what I did is I teased out the standards that are actually engineering standards. A lot of us, when we see the word science in the NGSS, we assume these are all science standards. So these are some of the secondary science standards that are really engineering standards. So designing to solve a problem of thermal energy, or using Newton's third law to solve a problem. These would be middle school standards. These would be high school standards. So like there's a lot of standards. And so to kind of go back over that, I think in high school, around 20% of the standards are not science. They're actually engineering standards. And so it's important for you to look, how do I know what they're going to be? It's important to look at the first few words in every standard. It'll tell you if it's going to be science or engineering. So if we look at this one, students evaluate competing designs. I know that's going to be engineering right away. Or the next one, they evaluate a solution to a problem. So like as you read the standards, always make sure you're looking at the first few words. Those are going to be the action words, and they're going to tell you what are the kids actually doing. So one thing that I think is important for all of us is to know we kind of should be doing engineering already. We just have to dig into the standards a little bit to figure out exactly what we're teaching. Another piece, how many of you have been to any of the workshops that I've done so far? Anybody, show of hands, have been to workshops that I've been? So it's a lot of you. So the majority of you. So I kind of want to, it's nice to see a lot of you. Thanks for all the hands. Lori, it's nice to see you again. So anyway, for me, I've tried to pare all of NGSS down to a simple cycle of inquiry. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these cards or even used cards and posters like this, maybe in your class. So what I've done over the last week is I've tried to take this model of inquiry that I use in science and modify it slightly so we can do engineering with a similar model. So I'm just going to walk you through that, and we'll just look for patterns. What changes as we change from this model to the next one? So this is kind of my engineering model. The first thing I would do is at the center, if we're doing engineering, we're not looking at a phenomena in the natural world. What we're doing is we're identifying a problem that we're eventually, let's see, I might have this listed wrong. I have the wrong slide. Give me 1 second. I showed you an old version. Bear with me. There we go. Let me try that again. Okay, pretend you didn't see that. All right, let's try that again. Okay, first change is going to be this in the middle. So the first thing you do in engineering, instead of having a phenomena in the center, what you have is a situation. A situation is a word that's found in the standards. It took me a while to figure it out, but it's essentially what's going on in the surroundings. What are the needs or the wants of humans that we're eventually going to solve? So the center of my cycle of engineering is going to just start with the situation. The next thing you want to do is you want to start to ask questions about the situation to figure out exactly what's going on. I know there are some workshops later in the week around design thinking or the D school. It's really cool work around that. And basically what you do is you interview a person to better establish what's the problem. And so you start with a situation and then you ask questions to better define the problems. And so if I kind of go back over that again, in science, we start with a phenomena and then we ask questions, whereas in engineering, we define the problem. It kicks us off onto this whole idea of design thinking. So we define what's the problem we're actually trying to solve. We then have kids make up a bunch of solutions for that problem. And so instead of just making one solution, we make an infinite, or at least a few solutions, and then we test those using just regular investigation. So we're doing science now, and then we're optimizing the solution. And so unlike science, where we're really trying to better understand the phenomena, what are we really doing in engineering? Defining a problem, coming up with solutions, and then coming up with better and better solutions to the problem over time. And so on the website, I've added those additional cards, and I'm going to kind of do a mini lesson to kind of walk you through the elements of engineering right now. So let's do that. Ooh, perfect. All right, perfect, awesome. Does this show up for you on? Can you see these my hands here and you see these cards here? Perfect, awesome, thanks so much. If we start with the cards that I have here, first step is going to be the situation. So the situation is the problem that we're eventually going to identify a problem that we're going to solve. Again, the flip side, if we're doing science, is I'm using a phenomena. But if we're doing engineering, what I'm doing is identifying a situation. What are the best situations? Ones in your own class or community that the kids are eventually going to solve a problem for. So that's kind of the situation we're getting at. They shouldn't be seen as negative. So like what we heard Vianney say was like, the situation is we want to go to the moon, and we want it to not just be men on the moon. We want women on the moon as well. And then we want to go to Mars. So like, that's the problem that we're eventually going to solve. So we interview the situation, we ask it questions, and the next step we're going to do is we define the problem, and we better define the problem. What makes these cards nice, if you want to use these with your students, is they have what you should say as a teacher at the top. So these are like teacher questions or teacher language at the top. So what are we designing for? What's the problem that we're designing a solution for? And then the backs of the cards have a rubric for what does it mean to define a problem in science. So this is like a 4-step rubric for defining a problem in the proper way. And so you can teach the kids like, this is defining problems. And when you're defining problems, if you really want to follow the rubric, here's how we do it right here. As we go to the next one, designing solutions, what we're doing is like coming up with the multiple solutions, describing the criteria and the constraints. We're then testing those, and then we're optimizing, kind of using what's on the back of this to figure out exactly, is that the right solution? And so for me, this process is not a process of inquiry anymore. Like, we're not trying to figure out a phenomena. This is a process of design. How do we do this over and over and over to get better and better at a solution to a specific problem? Now, I wish somebody would have given me this lesson 8 years ago, but I'm going to just give you a quick lesson on how to do engineering and how to walk through the steps of engineering, all the way from problem to kind of optimizing solutions. And so I have to share screen with audio. And if you don't have audio on, make sure you turn that on your computer, because I'm going to show you a quick little video. And let me try that again. Almost there, folks. Thanks, bear with me. And perfect. So close, Laura. I don't know what's going wrong. I know. Weird. Okay, sorry about this, people. I've got an engineering problem. Does that show me on the sidewalk? We good? Yay! Could you find the chat also in Zoom? I should have said that before. If you haven't found the chat, that'd be great. You're going to help me. We're going to try to figure out the situation and figure out exactly what's going on with the situation. So this is me in Monterrey, Mexico. So this is me just on the side of the sidewalk in Monterrey, Mexico. And let me just play a little video. And so this is, I'm going to set the situation for you. Let's go here. Gotcha. Let me do that again. Gotcha. Let me do that again. Okay. Got a little bit of a situation here. So let's take a stab at what's the problem in the chat. What do you think the problem might be? Oh, somebody's wondering, like, you lost something. You dropped your keys, maybe? Paul dropped a coin. So the keys are missing. There's soil eroding from underneath the sidewalk. I love that. Sheila, nice. So we've got a little bit of a situation here. So the first thing that we do in engineering when you see a situation like this is you interview the person. And so what you're going to hear now is my wife come up to me, and she's going to start interviewing me and try to figure out exactly what the problem is. And so you'll hear her ask about 5 or 6 questions right away.
Paul, what are you doing?
I lost my key.
How?
It fell out of my pocket and it fell in here. I can't reach it. I can't reach down to get it.
How far down is it?
It seems like about 2 feet.
How wide is it?
It's about like that big. So I gotta figure out how to get it back out.
All right, do you want to put your hand by the crack so we can see how wide it is?
Yeah, it's about like that wide. I don't want to stick my hand down there.
Gotcha. All right. So we've got a situation. What I'm doing right now as we go through this is I'm going to try to just do a quick mini lesson to teach you the elements of engineering using this simple problem. Now, this is not a hard problem. And the reason why is I'm not trying to teach you how to solve a hard problem. I'm just trying to teach you how to think like an engineer. And so we're going to use some of this language explicitly. We're recording this as well. So if you ever want to do like a mini lesson like this with your own students, you could watch this recording again and just kind of see the steps through which I kind of go through how to explain a situation like this. So the situation is kind of what we're trying to figure out. And you can see on the other side of situation is a phenomena. And I would tell kids explicitly, you could use like a document camera, or they could just gather around a table to do lessons like this. I would say, since we're doing engineering, we always start with the situation. So the situation is kind of established. We watch the video. And so the next step, if we're doing engineering, is to identify the problem. And in middle school, they should be able to identify the problem from a given situation. So help me out, class. Play along with me. In the chat, could you identify what the problem is? What would you identify the problem is? Somebody help me out in the chat. Gotcha. Lost my key, cannot reach the keys. You need to retrieve your keys and you can't get them. So let's go with that one. Thanks, Rosa. And I would say, try to be as specific as you can with the problem. So the keys, let's go with that one. The keys are in the hole. Keys are in the hole, too far to reach. I like it, to reach. Okay, so we're going to identify that as the problem. So this problem is going to be what we're working towards from here on out. Like, how do we get those keys out? So you always start with situation, use questions to identify what the problem is going to be. Next step, we have to identify the solution. So what kind of a solution are we going to come up with? Well, the easiest thing would be to ask kids, like, what are we going to do? But in general, we have to come up with some kind of a device. So we're going to come up with a device. And so we're going to make a thing. So to the kids, like, we've identified the problem, now we have to come up with a solution. And then I'm telling you that the solution is going to be a device that you have to make. Now, what goes on this board? It depends on what you're teaching. It could be a device, it could be a system, it could be a computer program. You can write whatever you want on it, but you want to define exactly, like, what are we having the kids do? Are they making a system? Are they constructing a thing? But in this case, we're going to say, we're going to build a device. We're actually going to make a device. So what's the next step we do? If I were to just let my kids go and have them build something, like Twyla says, a magnet on a string to drop into the hole, or a wire coat hanger that's been opened up, we wouldn't be engineers. We would be inventors. So let me kind of delineate the difference between an inventor and an engineer. An inventor is somebody who comes up with a solution to a problem. An engineer is someone who uses scientific information to come up with a solution to a problem. So what do engineers do? They learn science so they can apply the science to actually solve problems. And so what makes the difference between an engineer and an inventor? I hope this is resonating with you, because I didn't know this back in the day. If you're not using science to understand the solution, then you're really not doing engineering, you're just doing inventing. You have to tell them what science you want them to use. And let me show you how I can move this. So let's say I want you to use the science of biomimicry. So what is biomimicry, if you're not familiar with that? Biomimicry is looking for like solutions in nature. How has nature solved the problem? And then use their solutions to make our solutions better. So if I put this right here, you have to use scientific information of biomimicry. Can you feel your brain change a little bit? It's not like a wire coat hanger. I have to think about something in nature that grabs something from a crevice and pulls it out. And then I have to use that to build my design. So let's take a stab at that, class. What are some things that animals, let's go with animals. What are animals that have to reach in and grab material from a crack or a crevice? And throw that in the chat. What are some animals that have to pull things out of a crack, and then how do they do it? So bird beak, Brooke, thanks for that. Adriana, claws, the curlew, Gail, I'm so happy you said the curlew, one of my favorite birds of all time. The anteater, Erica, really good. Nora, the hummingbird, spiders, the long sticky tongues of chameleons, Kathleen, really, really good. I love that as an example. So now we've established that we have to learn about structures in living things and function in living things, and then we have to apply it into the solution that we have. Next step, we're not right there yet. The next step we have to do is we have to define what are going to be the criteria, and then what are going to be the constraints of a solution. So defining what the criteria and constraints are, and I would go middle school, you should get kids to start helping you come up with the constraints and come up with the criteria. Like they should be able to help you kind of do that. Let me kickstart us. What would be criteria for this solution? It has to be able to remove the key. So it has to be able to remove the key. That would be a criteria. What would be another criteria? They have to use biomimicry in the solution. That has to be another part of it. What would be another criteria? It has to be a physical device. So what are the criteria? Those are basically, what does it need to do? We're going to use that in a second to figure out, is it a good device or not? So that will be like a checklist of, did it meet the criteria or not? Next step is going to be constraints. Constraints. What are some of the constraints that I would have? Examples of constraints could be... Boop, boop. Sorry, I got to mute people. What are some of the constraints? I think one constraint would be money. It can only cost $2.50. That would be a constraint. What would be another constraint? It has to be able to be used by one person. So it has to be able to operate by one person. Help me out, chat. Other constraints, it has to be reusable. I love that, Kathleen. So reusable. In other words, I have to be able to use it here, and it's not just going to go in the hole. Also, we could talk about, like, some of the constraints are constraints of the problem. I love Erica's idea by it's not being electric. It has to be like manually operated. I like that as an idea. And so these are going to be the constraints. Constraints are basically the limitations that we have. We want to set that up because there's no perfect solution to problems. They're all going to be a trade-off between all of these. Next step. So if we look at where we are on this pathway of design, at this point, what we've done is just define the problem. We use the situation to define the problem. What have we done in defining the problem? Everything on the back. We've identified the scientific information we need. We've got the criteria, and then we've got the constraints. What's the next step is we got to design solutions. So like, help me out, chat. So based on these criteria and constraints, describe a solution you might have for this problem. What would you do? Describe your device. It's got to hit biomimicry. It's got to cost $2.50. Got to be operated by one person. Get a stick and stick it in the hole. Get a hook hanger, the shape of a bird beak. So we've got Erica's model. We've got Juan's model, a mechanical claw made out of branches. And then we've got a branch with gum, Cynthia, nice work. So these are the models that we have. So we can think of these as devices that we have. What would I want you to do? I would want you to physically make the thing. Then I would want you as a student to say, this is the problem we're trying to solve. Then I would want you to show me it. So show me Erica's device. And then I would want Erica to show me how it hits all of the criteria and then how it satisfies all of the constraints. So how do I assess the work of the student? It's based on the criteria and the constraints that I have here. So what should we teach kids in upper elementary? This, again, if you teach middle school, is not your problem. So what should we teach them there? Teach them the words criteria, constraints, solution, and problem. What should you do in middle school? They should start coming up with these criteria and constraints on their own and coming up with multiple solutions. And now let me get to the high school. What do we do at high school? We prioritize the criteria and constraints. So like, what is something that's important? I want it to be like, use the least amount of energy. Maybe I'm going to prioritize it, that it is not going to use materials that create fossil fuels. And so I'm prioritizing all of the criteria, and I'm prioritizing all of the standards in the solution itself. What's another piece as you move towards high school is the problems should get much bigger. Like keys in a crack is something we would do in like kindergarten. But as we get bigger and bigger, then the problems get broader and broader and broader. And Felipe's butterfly-like tongue with a tube and wire hairs hanging inside it is a wonderful solution. Also might exceed $2.50, but I still want to see it made. Like that sounds fantastic. And so what we just did there, like, is just a quick mini lesson on what engineering is and how is engineering different than science. One thing that I've learned through the work around NGSS is kids will never learn that on their own. They're never going to learn what a criteria is, what a constraint is. They're never going to learn how to identify criteria and constraints or prioritize them, and then come up with a solution that kind of is a trade-off between all of those. You got to teach it to them. And you shouldn't feel bad about doing it. Like teaching them what's science, what's engineering, like authentically what it is, and then let them try to do it and apply it. Last thing that makes this hard is in science, think of your science fairs from back in the day. Like, what do we do in science? We find something we're interested in, we gather all this data, and then we make a poster. Like, this is what we learned in the science investigation that we did. That's not what engineers do. They make something called a design poster. And the thing that's different is they have a client that they're working for. And so they interview the client. What do you need? Like, what process or system or mechanics do you need? And then I design for you. So like a thing you should start thinking about as a teacher is, who's the client? Am I the client and are they working for me? Or am I going to find somebody or a problem in my community that the kids could solve? So think about that. Like, if we do have an NGO in our area that's trying to save this whatever, some weird frog, having that person come in and your kids interview it in your biology class and come up with a solution that would protect this endangered frog, like that all of a sudden becomes really, really authentic. Like, what do you have to do? You got to find the person, you got to find the problem, and then they kind of come up with a solution. The hard part is not the solutions. Kids are creative. Like, that's the key thing. Awesome. Gloria, I love that as well. So like, coming up with research is a big part. Like, obtaining information to see what's out there already is a big part of engineering as well. So what I want you to do, you've been in for a bit, you've been in Zoom for a little bit. Could you take 1 minute and then just reflect? Give me one reflection. So spend the next minute reflecting. What is your one reflection of our time together over the last 40 or so minutes? What's your one reflection? And if you could don't put it in the chat, you don't have to, but could you just write it down or think it out? What's your one reflection? I could quick share mine. I think it was like listening to the NASA engineer was, I think, super important. And not that I need to hear that, I think other kids need to hear that. So like for me, that Skype a scientist, getting actual scientists and engineers in the classroom seems huge. Let's look at some of the other reflections we're seeing in the chat. Providing criteria and constraints will help them narrow the solution to meet the standard, or me narrow it down. If you're not using science, you're not doing engineering. That's a good reflection. Engineering goes beyond. The link to our science class is that engineers start with the science and inventors pull from other sources. So I think the hook, maybe, I don't know, Russell, is that what you're thinking? Like the hook to your class is through the science that we use in the engineering? Gotcha. Alrighty, next step. Yes, thank you. Love the cards applied specifically to engineering. Thanks, Gloria, that's cool. The next thing I want to do is this whole idea of how do we get more girls in engineering or more engineering in our classes is a problem. It's a situation, for lack of a better word. And for us to better understand it, like coming up with questions will be the only way we'll get closer. So you've come up with a reflection. Could you come up with a question? What is your burning question that you have around engineering, specifically engineering related to NGSS or science classes? What's your one question? Take a second to think that through. I guess I'm just reflecting on what I just said. So I would say like the big problem is how do we get more engineering in our students? And I guess my big question would be who ends up being the client? Who are we working for? And that's just kind of a question out there to nobody in particular, but that's kind of what I'm curious about. As we spend those last 13, 14 minutes together, I'd love to not talk, or at least hear a lot of you talk. So anybody have a question that they mind sharing with us? You could use your hand to throw it up, or you could throw it in the chat. Let's start with Juan. Juan, do you mind kind of unmuting and jumping in so we could hear your voice? Walk us through your question.
Yeah, so I mean, I think up to this point, I think I more or less have a little bit of engineering, or I try to apply engineering in every unit. Sometimes I kind of find it, almost impossible to like put it into practice in every unit. So, I mean, right now I feel it's my last unit that I focus most on engineering, but
Gotcha.
I guess my thing is that like too late to implement engineering with students? Because I kind of see it like,
give me another unit that it's not as intentional.
So
what's another example?
So for climate change, let's say, I mean, the one that I apply engineering on the most is the one for natural hazards. But then the other ones, like, let's say human impacts on the environment, or like my unit on climate change. I mean, for climate change, it's like they're analyzing data. They are gathering data and making observations. Which can
I give you some example? Like, let me give you an example of something that another teacher used. So like number one, I think one thing to think about that you kind of bring to mind is where does it go? Is it at the beginning of the unit or at the end? And I would always argue it's at the end. So like at the beginning of the unit, what I would tell your kids in the climate change, if you and I were co-teaching it together, I would say at the end of this unit, you're going to come up with a solution to climate change that will be local, and you'll make one thing that will help solve this problem. So at the end, you're going to make a device or something that will help solve climate change in a more local way. And so at the end, they're going to do that. And what is all the science we're doing along the way? It's learning about climate change so we actually can apply that at the end. So like by having that from day one, this is what we're working towards. I think it allows you to always be anchored in why are we learning this science and what could we do? So there was a teacher I worked with in Jordan, and she had the kids, I think it was more like, I don't think it was climate change as only one type, but it was more global impacts of humans. And so by the end of the unit, the kids had to make a device that might help solve a local problem. So it could be like a way that we're monitoring algae using some little thing, or it's like she wanted them not to just do research. Are you with me on that one? She wanted them to like make a thing that could make the world better, but it might be just a flyer or something that is informing people about something. So it's like, I think that's a way to start thinking about it. Like, how can it drive what we're doing? And how can it be added to the environment too? Also, like find somebody like there's got to be people in your area who that's their job, is they're trying to make change on climate change, and having the kids interview that person rather than you, it'd be better. I was working with teachers in Barcelona, and they had a person come in who deals with homeless and building like shelters for homeless. And the kids were working on a unit on thermal energy, and they interview her about how do you make a device that people could sleep in? What is your constraints? What's your budget? How big could it be? And as they interview her, are you with me? They're like really starting to make something that's more authentic. I don't know. That's just ideas. Do you consider creating a system to manage something, but not actually designing the physical things, engineering? Kathleen, I totally do. And if you look at that, like in the standards, it says students can make a process or a system or a computer program or something. It doesn't always have to be a thing, for sure. Other questions out there? What are some other questions you might have?
There was a question about assessing, Paul.
Yeah, like how do you do that?
Yeah, do you have to give a paper assessment?
Yeah, that would be really lame. You could do it. I think formatively it'd be really good. Like to say, here is this design brief, identify the problem, the criteria, the constraints in it. So like formatively, I think that'd be really good. But I would argue that your summative should be authentic. So at the end, you are talking about what you've made. So a design brief where you're talking about like, this is the problem, this is the client I was working for. So like a video talking through that seems really authentic, or you're just interviewing the student and they're telling you what they did. It's really important that it's not about like what they made. That's, I think, what I screwed up when I was teaching this. It was always about the robot or the thing they made at the end, not about the process. I didn't have the kids do enough of like, this is what I was trying to solve. This is my criteria. And so I don't think they knew enough about the engineering. I think that's the thing that I was kind of getting wrong. Question also, Kathleen, for rubrics for the engineering standards are totally in the NGSS. Is it okay if I share my screen and we can take a look at that for a second? So let's just jump there to find like, how do I assess students on this? So let's go. I hope I'm sharing this. Laura, can you see my screen? Is that right? All right. So let's say we're looking, let's just find a specific one. So if we're looking at physics, so forces, this one. So if we're looking at this, let's just choose one. So this is one standard. So if we look at the specific standard, students apply engineering ideas to design, evaluate, and refine a device that minimizes force in a collision. So like we can see the practices designing a solution. The evidence statement is the most important thing that a lot of teachers aren't familiar with. So like when you're looking at any standard in NGSS, somebody's already come up with a rubric on how to assess this specific standard. And they wrote it here. It's called the evidence statement for that. And so this is based on evidence of student learning. And so if we dig into that at the bottom, let me zoom in for a second. So this would be a really good rubric for this assessment. Number one, the student uses scientific knowledge to generate their solution. So the first thing I'm looking for is, did they use their understanding of science to solve this problem? In this case, it's minimizing force by increasing the time of the collision. So that'd be point one. Point two, do they describe the criteria, the constraints, and quantify that? Number three, do they evaluate their solutions? And then number four, do they refine and optimize the design solution? So like when you're looking for specific rubrics for any of the NGSS standard, I hope that helps. Like find the standard and then find the evidence statement that's at the bottom of that. And that'll be a really tight rubric. Another thing to use to kind of show you these cards one more time is on the backs of the cards, I always have like a 3 or a 4 point rubric on how to optimize solutions or how to design a problem or define a problem. So the backs of those cards are really, really helpful, I think, as well. And we have some posters that have those kind of on the back of it as well.
Hey, Paul, there's a
yes,
question about math in there. How do you reduce the aversion to math?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say with that is be true to the standard itself. So like example, I was working with some teachers in Peru and they taught a physics class to 9th graders and they were going to try to do more integrated class. And they just added a bunch of algebra and things on kinematics, and like they lost half the class because mathematically they couldn't go where they were going. And if you really would be true to the standard, it doesn't force them into that level of understanding of math. I think that's one big thing, is that we don't want it to be a limit. Also, I think it's important to start telling kids like what it takes to be an engineer or a scientist. Like it's not about inventing. I don't know, Laura, do you mind sharing your just stories they would tell you when they come to MSU?
I think you kind of talked about it already, that the students just did not understand that engineering really was going to be an application of science and math. They had not heard that message in high school. I think, you know, I think they didn't really ever have engineering courses in their K-12 or K-10 education, depending how much science they took. And so they mostly thought of engineering as inventing. They didn't really understand how much science and math they were going to have to be using.
Gotcha. And even like, that's not a, you also could have somebody who goes into like an engineering technology or something that is more application and not so much driven by science as well. I think it's just important that kids understand those pathways before they get there, I think is the biggest thing. There's some posters out there that are, I will try to find them and put them on that page, but they give you like the 8 or 9 different types of engineering, and they're cool posters that you could hang up in your room. So kids could know like, oh, that's what a civil engineer does, or that's what an industrial or an environmental engineer. I think that would be important. I've seen posters around like, what do engineers look like, which have been cool as well. Other questions that you might have? Or questions from the chat or reflections?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead, Aubrey.
So this is where, for example, if I'm doing a project and we're in our science aspect of it, we're learning all about ecosystems, different types of ecosystems, human impacts on ecosystems. And then they get to choose which impact they want to find. So like they get to choose the problem. So for example, they choose pollution. And they're looking here, we're in Guatemala, right? So they're looking at different types of pollution in Guatemala. I have some students who choose air pollution. I've had others who choose, water pollution, and others land pollution. And we're connecting those to the SDGs. Is that okay if like my main science focus was ecosystems and interactions and biodiversity and different biotic and abiotic factors, but in their engineering design process, they're going to have to learn things about, it depends on what they chose, right? So like some of them are going to have to learn about filtration systems. Others are going to have to learn, and I didn't teach that science part of it. That's okay, right? Is it still a successful, like, because they're going to learn that science based on their research as they're evaluating other solutions to come up with their criteria and how they can make it?
It's a really good question. Yeah. I'll always be the annoying, let's go to the standards guy. So let me do that one more time just to find one. I'm trying to find one, Aubrey, that kind of matches with what you're talking about, because I think we can get some really cool answers to questions like that. So this is an environmental science standard. Evaluate and refine a solution that reduces human impacts on natural systems. So like, at least from what I heard you say, that's a lot of, you were dealing with ecosystems, but I'm just interested in the blue words here. And what they're saying is they're not saying kids will come up with a solution. Okay. They're not going to make a water filtration system. I think this is really interesting that they're just evaluating one, or they're refining one that's already there. Like for me, that seems as a biology teacher, that's more manageable. You know what I mean? Do some research on it and how could I like refine it to apply it in the local situation? Because you can't be an expert in all, I don't know if that's what you're getting at, Aubrey, but you can't be an expert in all of those areas.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was getting at. Because I was like, well, I'm going to overwhelm myself. So yeah, I needed a little, thank you.
Yeah. I've definitely drunk the Kool-Aid on NGSS, but there's so much good work that went into like these standards and what can kids actually do. So like whenever I'm like, they can't do this, I always look at the standard and be like, oh, they don't have to come up with a solution. That's only when they're like maybe in middle school and it's about an egg drop or something like that. So if we're really having global problems, let's like look at solutions that are out there, which is a lot more like real life, it seems like. Yeah, good question, Helen. Is there no engineering specific course? Is a really good question. So it depends on your school for sure. A lot of schools will have engineering threads. I think the nice thing about NGSS, and can I just speak for the NGSS itself? With their framework, what they said is we don't want to come up with standards that replace engineering courses that are already in schools. We want to make our science courses better by including engineering in them. I think that's an important way to think about this, that it's like the reason engineering's here is not to replace any kind of things that we might have in schools. I think having engineering threads in schools would be great for kids that really kind of want to take that path. I think that should be there. But yeah,
Oh,
what we're
how do
trying
you
to do
see
is
the
just
ETS
make it better.
standards fit though into a school where they don't have an engineering class?
Yeah, so the ETS, there are some standards that are generic called the ETS, and those are really these three things. So how do we get kids to define problems? How do we get them to design solutions? And then how do we optimize solutions? So if you don't want standards that are specific to the science you're doing, or based on what Laura just said, like maybe I'm doing a science unit and I want to add engineering to it, but there's no engineering standard, using the ETS standards is a really good way to just like, because they're more generic. It's always like define the criteria, define the constraints. It might be helpful to do that. Yeah. Hey, we're going to take a quick break. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then I think there's a chat and chill with Paul. So if anybody wants to come and ask other questions, you could do that. But I wanted to say big thanks. Thanks for everything. And yeah, whoever said that, Claire, yeah, I'd love to answer a question like that. But big thanks to Laura. I'll stay on for just a second, Claire, to bang that one out. But thanks so much for coming. And if you want to come and chat, I'll see you in a bit. Cheers. Thanks. Yeah, Claire, I would say we built it around the different ETS standards and also the evidence statements of all the different standards. I don't know, Claire, if you're with us still. So, but what Laura and I did is we went through the evidence statements of all the engineering standards from K to 12, and then found like what do kids have to be able to do. And then we kind of use the ETS standards to make these, more generic cycle of design. I don't know. Does that help?
It does. Yeah. I was just looking, my grade 7 and grade 8, my upcoming units each have an ETS standard, and we've done, my school is narrowed down to essential ones. And so it's only like, it's the 1.3 and then the 1.4. So I was just looking at like, I wonder how we would get to that like modeling process and the iterative testing process. And I, like, if it's worth it just to kind of go through the whole thing with my students, even if that's the only standard we're reporting on, or if there'd be a way to just kind of hone in on that process of the end of like, just like you were saying, they don't actually have to make something based on the standard we've been given, you know, they don't actually have to do a lot of it, but then what that process would look like kind of for those end pieces.
Yeah, I would always like, when I work with a school, I'm always like, let's start by just doing all the standards, not the ETS. Let's leave those to the side at the beginning because there's no science in it. They're more generic. And so like, let's populate our courses with that and then add those more as needed. I don't know. I think that just makes more sense to teachers because there's no, are you with me? There's no, what am I teaching in here? This is more a generic way to think about it. So like, how do I assess
attached to, we've got them attached to a non-ETS standard. And so it's a unit where we've got like a physical science one and then an ETS standard together, but it's just the ETS ones that are like after solutions have been designed, looking at the comparing the ones.
Yeah, it fills a lot of the gaps in of like, okay, all right, if we're designing a solution, how do we define the problem? How do we optimize it? So using those can do that. I like that idea, Claire, as well. I'm going to jump off and then come back.
Yeah.